News Chief Washington Correspondent,
Major Garrett, yes, CBS, yes, hi.
Major Garrett.
Major, that's nonsense, and you should know better.
Is Major out of the doghouse?
The answer is yes.
Welcome to the very best part of my broadcast week. I'm Major Garrett. This is the Takeout. Thanks for hanging out with us. Thanks for finding us. And whichever way you do, our beloved early adopters on all podcast platforms, CBS News Streaming, of course. That's why we have the cameras here. POTUS, Sirius XM, POTUS Channel 124, and more than 70 radio stations across our great country. Thanks so much for being here. You know, I love the show because I have all authority over what we do with this show week to week. I decide. And this week we're going to do a little podcast cross-pollination. What do I mean by that? Well, CBS has an excellent new podcast available on all those podcast platforms called Missing Justice. Justice is a very important concept in our country, and when it's missing or goes missing, or there's not even really an attempt to find it, that's a story. And that's why I have Cara Korte here and Bo Erickson. They are colleagues of mine at CBS News. They are the reporters and authors of Missing Justice and the podcast, which has now gone through 5 episodes. The 6th episode will be next week. Cara Korte, Bo Erickson, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Cara, I want you to start with us because you end every episode by reminding people of something they may not know. And a lot of people in the greater D.C., Virginia, Maryland area may not know it. We live and work on ancestral lands, do we not?
We do. Anyone who's listening to this lives and works on ancestral native land. That's something that I was introduced to for the first time actually on the campaign trail. Bo and I both covered the 2020 presidential campaign. I covered Senator Bernie Sanders. And a lot of his events started with what's called land recognition. And that was usually an Indigenous person coming on stage, reciting some kind of prayer in their native language, and recognizing what came before us to be there in that moment. And that was something Bo and I talked about really early on in this project, was that we wanted in some way to include some kind of recognition in the project, because it's just not something I was ever taught growing up in school, and I think it's something that a lot of us could think about more often, about the circumstances that led us all to be here.
And ladies and gentlemen, that question to Cara is a clue about what Missing Justice is about. It is about the pursuit and search for justice Native American lands in our country, specifically in Montana and Wyoming, correct, Bo?
Yes, we focus on a case specifically out of the Northern Cheyenne Reservation in southeastern Montana, and we walk through this one specific case, a woman named Christy Woodenthigh, who unfortunately died when she was 33 years old, around March 6, 2020. We walk through what happened that night, her family's response to her death, and how the family and tribal leaders had to push federal law enforcement to first investigate her death, and then we follow as reporters how that investigation unraveled for the first 4 episodes.
So let me ask you this, Cara. You and Bo are both Washington, D.C. based reporters. What made you curious about whether or not justice exists, or to the degree it does or doesn't exist, on native lands? Why is that a D.C. story for D.C. reporters?
It goes back to back before the founding of this country, which is that there was an exchange that happened over 2 centuries of time between the U.S. federal government and native tribes. And essentially, the most basic trade was, as the federal government is going to take away the tribe's land in exchange for being displaced somewhere else. And also part of that trade was that the federal government pledged to protect native tribes. It's what's called a trust responsibility. This is federal legal doctrine. So the federal government is legally responsible to protect native people on native land. Another thing that we weren't really familiar with during this process. And because of that link to the federal government, on some reservations like Northern Cheyenne, which we cover, there are federal police officers policing these lands and investigating these major crimes. So that is the link. Northern Cheyenne is a reservation of 5,000 people. It's nowhere near Washington, D.C., but the link to the federal government is very strong through this policing lens.
And are native lands sovereign lands? And why, if that's true, does that matter in this story?
They are sovereign lands. Bo, do you want to talk more about that?
Yes, they are sovereign lands. When we enter Northern Cheyenne in our first episode, we are entering a different nation. You see both American flags. You do see some American flags, but what we really see is a Northern Cheyenne flag, and it's a morning star. And that's the flag that they fly and they feel representative of their tribe. But when we get to talk about sovereignty, one of those aspects that go into sovereignty is the promise that the federal government made many years ago, starting in 1868 with the Northern Cheyenne Treaty, saying that, yes, you will be a sovereign nation, but as this trust responsibility, as this promise that the federal government is making to you, we will provide certain aspects of benefits, certain aspects of services to you as a tribe. For instance, law enforcement here. Mm-hmm. They also do that with health services as well through the Indian Health Services Program. And
housing.
So this sovereign trust and responsibility between the federal government and tribes all throughout the country, the Supreme Court has actually called this a moral obligation for the U.S. government to uphold. We have to uphold this side of the bargain because tribal nations have upheld their side of the bargain.
And Cara, there are lots of dimensions to this history, to this origin story for our country. But what you and Bo do is you look at one case, one victim, one defendant, and the actions or inactions of those responsible for trying to find out how this victim, Christy Woodenthigh, died. Is there someone criminally responsible? And if that person is charged, how successfully they are or are not charged. That is to illustrate these larger dimensions, correct?
Exactly. Christy's story is a drop in the bucket of something called the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis, which there are plenty of numbers we can rattle off to show how Native Americans are subject to violence at higher rates, subject to homicide at higher rates, and
per capita.
Yes. For example, these are numbers according to the CDC. Homicide is the 6th leading cause of death for Native American women under 44. It's the 3rd leading cause of death for Native American men. And if you compare that to white men, per se, under the age of 44, homicide is not even in the top 10 cause of death. Mm-hmm. So it is an actual crisis that many people in the community are familiar with. We've seen this covered in mainstream media in true crime stories before, but what Bo and I wanted to do differently was that we found a lot of these stories were about one case, and it's kind of a classic whodunit mystery. Mm-hmm. When you listen to this podcast, there is no mystery as to who was responsible, or we have to be very particular with how we word this. There is no mystery around the parties at play. Mm-hmm. In Christy's death.
The parties involved.
Yes, the parties involved. It's not a whodunit. This
No.
is an investigation into how this could happen, what kind of mistakes were made, and this is emblematic of hundreds of thousands of other cases, just like Christy's.
And it's a story about a system, and is the system working? And if it isn't, who are the victims of a system that doesn't work? Mm-hmm. And that's the missing justice component, Bo.
Exactly, yeah. This is one story of many, is how a former Interior Department official told us. Because the system that we are specifically talking about is the federal government at the Interior Department. There's an agency there called the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And these officers are the one that police and investigate these crimes. And what we were told over and over again through all of our conversations with the tribal leaders is that the system, there's that adage of the system is broken. Well, this system is not living up to what it's supposed to be. They say if the system is staffed appropriately and it's given the amount of resources, they think this would help public safety on many reservations throughout the country.
That is the voice of Bo Erickson. He's also joined by his colleague and co-partner in the podcast Missing Justice, Cara Korte. I'm Major Garrett. The joyful noise you hear around us, our host restaurant, Riss. We come here many times. We're glad to be here again. More of our conversation about missing justice in segment 2 of the Takeout in just one moment.
A large part of this is because not many people know about the system outside of Indian country.
From CBS News, this is The Takeout with Major Garrett.
Welcome back to The Takeout. For those watching on CBS News Streaming, Riss is our host restaurant. We're thankful to them as always. Cara Korte and Bo Erickson are our guests. This is a little bit of cross-podcast pollination. I like to do that because obviously I believe in podcasts. They're a great way to find stories that help you understand something you may not have known well enough before that you're sort of curious about, or you stumbled upon it and didn't even know you were curious about it until you were pulled in. And let me tell you, if you listen to Missing Justice, you will be pulled in. It is a significant amount of work, and I'm very grateful to have both of you here. So every good story and every good podcast has a couple of compelling characters. Missing Justice has two. Christy Woodenthigh, we've already mentioned her, and Gerard David Three Fingers. Who's Gerard, Bo?
Gerard was Christy's common law husband and boyfriend for 9 years, starting just after 2011-ish, going to about March 6, 2020, the night that she died.
And explain briefly, Bo, the circumstances of that death.
So what happened, what was told in court and what we have from many official records that we got from the federal government is that on the night of March 6, 2020, Christy was run over outside of her home and Gerard was behind the wheel.
Of a truck?
Of his SUV, yes. And proceeded to then tragically pick up Christy and drive 5 or so miles to his mother's house. And that is when emergency services were called. And when those federal agents responded to the scene, they found Christy, unfortunately, dead on arrival.
And she was in the back seat?
She was in the back seat, yes. And so this was all testified to at the trial that we covered about a year ago in federal court in Billings, Montana.
Cara, summarize for the audience those who loved Christy's pursuit of justice, how they went about it, and what briefly happened.
Well, one thing I hope that's very clear once you listen to it is that Christy had many personal struggles in her life, but that didn't mean she was alone or forgotten. She was beloved as a mother and a sister.
When you say personal struggles, what do you mean?
She was an addict. Mm-hmm. She and Gerard, like so many people that struggle with addiction, I think, as we were told, had a codependency on one another, and they drank heavily. We also know that they both at times used methamphetamine. So they had personal struggles, but they also had as Bo said, very long relationship. They had multiple children together. What happened? Remind me of your question, Major.
So those who loved Christy
yes.
wanted something to be done about her death.
Yes, of course.
They sought justice. How did that process begin? And briefly, where did it end up?
Well, BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs Police, responded to Gerard's mother's house the night that he drove Christy over there after he ran her over. From there, what would happen on tribal land is that when a major crime is committed, such as someone being dead, federal investigators take up an investigation. That's either going to be BIA federal investigators or FBI federal investigators. In this case, it was the FBI. And what happened immediately that night, what we know is that Gerard was interviewed by a criminal investigator on site for 4 minutes. Which was striking to us.
4 minutes.
For a 4-minute long interview for a man who had admitted to running over a woman. I've said this to Bo many times. I could spend 10 minutes on what you had for breakfast today, Major.
Right.
So that was stunning to us. And from there, it was about 5 months that followed where there was no indictment for Christy's death. Eventually, Gerard Three Fingers, her partner, was charged with involuntary manslaughter, and that was eventually taken to trial.
And what happened at that trial?
We were there for this day and a half, 2-day trial. It consisted of about 8 witnesses in total. Some of them were forensics experts. There was one witness testimony, but really the core of the trial that we focused on were 3 officer testimonies that responded that night to Gerard's mother's house. And there were just remarkable omissions that were revealed on the stand. Mm-hmm. Major, what seemed like obvious mistakes were made. No one collected Gerard's blood alcohol content that night. After, in that 4-minute interview, he admitted to drinking a couple bottles of alcohol that day. No one got his official
Not a
blood
couple of
sample.
drinks, a couple of bottles.
A couple of bottles, exactly.
Leading one to my reasonably ask, might you be intoxicated?
Exactly.
And might we want to confirm this?
And might that,
for the record?
And might that impact your driving,
or your
perception,
judgment, or your
judgment.
memory?
Exactly.
None of that happened.
None of that happens. There was no way to legally prove that Gerard was intoxicated. So think about what the jury is hearing in that moment. They were presented with a case that because Christy was deceased, her blood alcohol content was tested, and they found that she was also legally intoxicated. They also found that she had methamphetamine in her system. Those statistics were given to the jury about Christy, the victim in this case, but not about Gerard, the perpetrator in this case.
So, Bo, a bigger picture question that also vectors off everything that Cara and I just discussed. So there are those in tribal leadership, people who have studied the history of this relationship, who describe it diplomatically as paternal. These treaties create this requirement, an aura of trust, but it's a kind of a paternal relationship with dimensions of indifference. Parents who have a responsibility but who really don't care. And I wonder, in your experience covering this story and looking at this issue broadly, one of the things you're trying to convey in this Missing Justice podcast is, yes, it's paternal, and oftentimes it's indifferent, systematically indifferent.
And indifferent would be a nice way to put it from a lot of the tribal leaders that we've spoken with. Cara and I were calling
That's
for...
the best thing they would say about it.
That would be a compliment,
Yeah, on the
basically.
best days, it's
Yes.
indifferent.
Cara and I talked and called tribal leaders throughout the whole country that have this federal law enforcement system. We spoke to at least 30 tribal leaders from 30 different reservations. And it was just shocking and just made me feel so stupid that I wasn't aware of this system until I really started looking into it, because everyone was saying the exact same thing. This agency is understaffed. There is a huge issue of trust between the tribal community and this federal agency that is run out of DC, and that nothing is really structurally being done to address it. And a large part of this is because not many people know about the system outside of Indian country. We have one former BIA official, Bureau of Indian Affairs official, who says no one gives a about Indian country but us. He's a native person from Montana, and that is a lot of the sentiment that we heard over and over again in conversations.
Can I also add to that?
Please.
What was also on repeat that we heard was, you talked about indifference and a system being broken. What a lot of Native folks said to us is that this is actually the system working, in that we talked about the historical ramifications of this story and what it's like to be a Native American today. These were people that were systematically cast aside. And whether we saw, great reporting.
In other words, this system reflects those intentions.
Exactly. And it's a ripple effect. When Native Americans were, separated from their land, when they were taken to boarding schools and stripped of their cultural identities, their language, their hairstyles, their diets, forced to eat different kinds of foods. We were told time and time again that this crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous people is just the most contemporary example of discrimination towards Native American people.
Mm-hmm. And one other thing, Cara, and about 30 seconds before we go to break, there's also this idea, if someone goes missing in these particular areas, there are no cameras. Nobody shows up. Meanwhile, they see Anglo missing people, even African American missing people, but very rarely a Native person.
Yeah, it's right now there's a huge national story about 4 white kids that were murdered in Idaho. Not New York City, but Idaho. In the middle of our reporting, Gabby Petito went missing, and every person brought up to us, I'm so happy that Gabby's family has peace. They know what happened to her, but why can't it happen here? Why can't we get that attention here?
Why can't it happen here? That is one of the thematic questions raised by the podcast Missing Justice. Its reporters and authors, Cara Korte and Bo Erickson, are our guests. More of our conversation on the other side of this break. I'm Major Garrett, and this is The Takeout.
If that was my sister or my mother or someone I loved who was killed and I had to sit in that gallery, I would never say this was a fair trial.
From CBS News, this is The Takeout with Major Garrett.
Rennie questioned if the BIA was properly investigating Christy's case, and she feared that the chances of Gerard being charged got slimmer with every day that passed.
That's where the lack is, when they investigate. They don't do a thorough job. And me, I'm like a 48 hours type of person. Get everything you can in that within that time frame. Don't leave any stones unturned. I watch these programs, so why can't it happen here?
Welcome back to The Takeout. Riss is our host restaurant. This is a heavy topic, so we're not having lunch. We're just going to have water and coffee because it feels appropriate to us to proceed that way, but we're always grateful for hospitality extended to us by Riss here in downtown D.C. Cara Korte, what we heard is your voice there just a moment ago talking to Rennie Pena. Who's Rennie Pena? And this underlying question of investigatory steps that are basic that anyone who watches a popular TV show, 48 Hours, product placement, knows about. And yet walk our audience through the observation not only of Rennie Pena, but others about basic things that simply didn't happen in this particular case.
So frustrating. You can hear it in your voice. Rennie Pena was the tribal president of Northern Cheyenne when Christy died in 2020, which is the highest elected official at Northern Cheyenne. She was also Christy's neighbor. She lived across the street from Christy, and she knew Gerard for his entire life. So she is really entrenched in this story. And she was instrumental in forcing those BIA investigators to find justice for Christy, to arrest Gerard, to do something, essentially, because there were 5 months where no one really heard from BIA investigators. I think it's also critical to remember that Rennie, she's no longer the Northern Cheyenne tribal president, but she is a delegate in what's her role now?
She was a state representative
Yeah.
in Montana. So she's actually gone into the statewide system then,
Right.
ran for office, and she represented the Northern Cheyenne area in the state legislature.
Right.
To try to,
Right.
Amongst
So
many
let's
things,
go through
raise
some
this.
of the basics. We mentioned earlier that the interview was 4 minutes, which is less time than most people on a Monday talk about the Sunday football games when it's football season.
Yes.
So there's that. There was no registration or attempt to register for the record the potential defendant, who ultimately became the defendant, Gerard David Three Fingers' blood alcohol level. What else, Bo, didn't happen?
We found
That would
out.
fall into the category of basic.
We found out at trial that the 3 BIA federal agents that testified at trial, none of them wrote a police report. No one documented
There's
what
a dead
happened.
body
Yes.
in their jurisdiction, and none of them wrote a report.
Yes. And then, so we
And
are...
think about what that means at trial.
Yes.
There's
And so-
no official record
Right.
of what happened that night.
Right.
And so we're sitting there in the courtroom with Christy's large family sitting on the other side of the gallery from us. And this is the first time that anyone is hearing how these agents actually investigated, because there were questions about how they investigated from the family, but this is actually proof. These are the agents admitting to doing it this way. And then this all kind of ramped up into this last agent talking about this car that ran Christy over, Gerard's car, how they took the car away from the crime scene is not by calling a tow truck and removing it and trying to keep the evidence as crystal clear as it is on the car. This federal agent actually drove the car and parked it in a parking lot outside the BIA police station in the main town on the reservation. Not wearing gloves, but he literally drove the car. And when we heard the agent say this, we just saw Christy's family just like drop their
Melt.
heads, because it was like, whoa. And I say in the podcast, and we said in the moment, we were whispering to each other, being like, I watch CSI, I watch 48 Hours. We could probably clear this crime scene and process this crime scene at least this well. But these agents are trained to do it much better by the book. There's a 650-page book about how they're supposed to clear investigations, and that was not done.
And let's just talk about this for a second. So this is a vehicle clearly involved in the death of another human being. It would be the central repository of any relevant evidence
Exactly.
that would clear the potential defendant or confirm that defendant's guilt. So it's central to the entire question.
Right.
And it's driven by someone who is not looking out for ways to not contaminate that evidence, no gloves, and then left outside in the elements
Exposed.
for a very long time. Meaning, as a piece of evidence, it's destroyed.
Yes.
It's no longer relevant.
And what we're hitting at here is that, I grew up in Marshall, Minnesota, not far from a reservation. But if I was ran over in Marshall, Minnesota, there would be no question if my death would be investigated and if there would ultimately potentially be justice delivered. Regularly on Northern Cheyenne and many reservations, there's a big question of if the agents are even going to show up, the agents from the BIA or the FBI. There's been a lot of criticism in the FBI. We don't really cover that in our specific case here. But there's a question if they show up, and then we don't really know usually how the investigation happens because it's actually very rare for these cases in Indian country to ever make it to trial for a whole host of reasons. But according to the Justice Department, there are reports every year about the prosecution declination rates, the U.S. attorneys declining to bring these cases. 64% of the 1,000 cases that were recently declined in 1 year was for insufficient evidence. So this is one case of many. Who knows what else has happened in other cases?
Well, when you don't gather evidence, then there's insufficient evidence. One follows the other. Cara,
Exactly.
correct?
Exactly. And that, again, as I said before, this is not some great mystery as to how Christy died. That's not what this story is. What this story is a look at the system, incompetencies, carelessness, lack of training, lack of resources, whatever reasons you want to prescribe to this missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis. This is a story that has got it all, basically. And the result is that the trial that we saw, I don't know. Well, I'll put it this way. If that was my sister or my mother or someone I loved who was killed and I had to sit in that gallery, I would never say this was a fair trial. And it was for reasons like lack of evidence or lack of reports.
And the defendant, Gerard David Three Fingers, had a public defender. An aggressive one, as I listened
Yes.
to your podcast.
Very skillful.
Very skillful, who did what any competent defense attorney would do. Drive a truck through holes in the prosecution's case. Holes created by the lack of basic investigative maneuvers from the start.
Yeah, and I hope that's clear in the podcast. I hope we transferred our feeling of being in the trial, which was very quickly.
I mean, the public defender did what the public defender is supposed to do.
100%. She, as you said, she found all of the blemishes and she just shined a light on them. And our feeling in the trial very quickly was, oh, we see what the strategy is here. It was to highlight Christy and choices that Christy had made, like the fact that she was drunk, that she was tested positive for meth. Christy was described as aggressive and assaultive. No one did the same for Gerard's behavior because there was no way to officially confirm how Gerard was acting.
Well, there were no witnesses to this.
There were no witnesses to the direct incident. There was a witness brought forward of earlier in the night that there was some squabble between Christy and another woman, and she just kind of talked about that moment. But there's no specific witnesses, and I should just mention real quickly, the bar that they were trying to prove was he was charged for involuntary manslaughter. So intent upon the charge didn't even matter, that he didn't have to intend to run Christy over, and that was never argued in court that he intended to do that. So the bar was much lower that the jury had to consider.
Which was that he acted recklessly and it resulted in someone's death.
Right. And it would seem, based on my listening and the recording of the factual evidence that nobody disputes, that could have been a prosecutable offense and a jury might have, under different circumstances, with harder evidence, found him guilty, but it did not. Cara Korte and Bo Erickson are my guests. Missing Justice is their excellent podcast segment for The Takeout from our host, Restaurant Risks, coming to you in just 1 second.
These officers are set up to fail. They're understaffed, they're overworked, they're underpaid. So it's very common that they cut corners and make mistakes.
From CBS News, this is The Takeout with Major Garrett.
Do you think, John, the lack of officers, the lack of resources, is that something that a quote-unquote bad guy could be aware of? That if I'm trying to get away with something, I know the right time to do it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there's people here that know the system better than the officers do. There's people here that know that the jail's closed.
Welcome back to The Takeout. That was another piece of sound from the excellent podcast, Missing Justice. Its reporters and authors, Cara Korte, Bo Erickson, colleagues of mine at CBS News are with us. Cara, we heard your voice again, talking to John Grinzel, not only about resources, but about if you wanted to get away with something and you knew the system, could you? Sounds like the essence of what you were trying to get at.
Yeah.
What's the answer to that?
John said,
And who's John?
absolutely. John was a former BIA police officer, investigator, even police chief. He had worked on numerous reservations throughout his long career, including on Northern Cheyenne. And when he retired a couple years ago, he immediately went to work privately for the Northern Cheyenne tribe. He runs what's called the NCIS, which is the Northern Cheyenne Investigative Services. And what he is basically there is to supplement the BIA, the tribal government doesn't trust the BIA, and John's been brought in to basically fill in any gaps to solve problems.
So for that community, he would be a trusted source because he knew the Bureau of Indian Affairs methods, good or bad, indifferent or otherwise, and is now an advisor or eyes and ears on whatever the Bureau of Indian Affairs police does or doesn't do in future cases. Right, Bo?
Yes, he's an expert voice, and he knows the system. And remember,
he can talk more candidly about it now, too.
He can definitely talk more candidly about it. But, like, for us, too, we just have to understand the system. And it's so complicated because it's a federal system that's run out of Washington, D.C. So a lot of the decisions that are made, like, there's a lot of code words and titles and things like that. So he is kind of taking that information, translating it to the tribal leadership so they can try to make informed questions, informed asks, and try to change the system that currently is, or at least ask for more resources.
And that sentiment of can bad guys exploit the lack of police resources here, we did not just hear that from Northern Cheyenne. We heard that from multiple reservations
and
across
Bo, we'll
the
get
country.
to the resource question in a moment, but it strikes me that for you and Cara, this was possibly unfamiliar terrain, not only in terms of its history, its geography, its language, and its traditions. Did you lean on someone to help you cover all that ground and cover it with appropriate curiosity and sensitivity?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because this is something that was very important to Cara and I from starting 19 months ago when we started this. We both grew up in the Midwest. I grew up a little bit closer to Indian country than Cara did in Minnesota. And I was familiar with the system, but nothing as to these specifics. And so when we really started researching this, we just knew that there was so much culturally, so much life experience that we did not have. For those listeners at home, we are both two white reporters. So we worked with a woman named Dr. Iris Pretty Paint. She's actually a double PhD. She's a member of the Blackfeet Nation in Montana. And her specific expertise is in cultural resiliency, trying to put into focus, into context, everything that's happened with this country and what the federal government has done to Native communities throughout the country, try to put into some type of context about how these communities move forward. There's a term called intergenerational trauma, and about how when you grow up on the reservations and you grow up in a native community, you have this intergenerational trauma of what your family members or your ancestors before you went through and what the federal government did to them. We obviously do not have that same experience.
No.
And so throughout the reporting process, throughout the production of this podcast, we had been consulting with Dr. Iris Prettypaint, having really good conversations with her about, this is what we kind of see it as. What don't we know? And we would have hour-long conversations with her, and that is where I really learned a lot here. And you kind of sit back at the end of the day, and Cara and I talk, and it's just like, we know how to cover the federal government, and we really like to hold people accountable here in DC, but we just felt personally so stupid not knowing a lot about this process because it was never taught to us. It's never discussed, and it is so complex. So having her help
and painful,
having her help put all of those different notes together so we could better understand it.
Cara, cover the resource part of this and paint a picture of, so if you live in a urban part of the United States or even a semi-urban part of the United States, you pick up the phone or you have your cell phone and you call the cops.
That's right.
You have a reasonable expectation of them showing up within the next 5 to 15 minutes. Reasonable.
Yes.
Not guaranteed, but a reasonable expectation. Not true on the res.
Well, even just that distinction of you call the cops, what number do you call when there's an emergency, Major?
911.
Yes, that is not the number for the police on the Northern Cheyenne tribe. So again, we talk about these cultural differences. They don't call 911. When we look at that trial, Gerard's trial, and we talk about the mistakes that were made by police officers, we wanted to know why. How could this happen? And there are two sides. Well, some people say there are three sides to every story, and we wanted to know what circumstances had to be occurring to lead to such blatant mistakes. Surely something is going on here because, and this is also important to note, the majority of BIA officers are Native people. So it's the majority of BIA officers are Native people. So when it comes to resources, we were just told by folks like John Grinsell that these officers are set up to fail. They're understaffed, they're overworked, they're underpaid. So it's very common that they cut corners and make mistakes. Something like calling for help. On Northern Cheyenne, we were told that if a cop comes in 30 minutes, that's good. That's considered a really good response time because they're so backed up. There are so few officers working at any given time. This is a reservation the size of Houston, Texas. And there are only a handful, 3 officers working at any given time. So imagine if there were 3 officers in Houston, Texas. Obviously not as many people, but you still have to travel from place to place. Exactly. And so that's
and real quickly, it's not as if there are fixed residences, but it's not as if the directions to that fixed residence are easy.
I mean, when we were trying to get around, we were calling, meeting people at their homes, at churches, wherever. What's your address? I don't really have an address, or the address won't work if you put it in your phone. We got lost almost every time we were trying to go somewhere. So imagine what happens if you're in a crisis and you call the police for help and they don't come for 30 minutes.
Or an hour, or 2 hours.
Or at all.
What
is your reaction going to be? What is the reputation of the police then going to be? So that fuels a lot of then animosity between these communities and the police.
Many, many issues at the heart of Missing Justice, an outstanding podcast put together by my colleagues at CBS News, Cara Korte and Bo Erickson. For our radio audience, we need to say farewell. For those on CBS News Streaming and our podcast platform, stay tuned, as I all know you always do, for the Takeout Outtake Especial. I'm Major Garrett, and we will see you next week.
They just really, want media and pop culture to stay away from all those horrible tropes.
From CBS News, this is The Takeout with Major Garrett.
Welcome to your Takeout Outtake Especial. My guests this week, Cara Korte, Bo Erickson, my colleagues at CBS News. They are the reporters and authors of Missing Justice, an outstanding new podcast just released by CBS News. 5 episodes available so far. The 6th will come out next week. Whenever you hear this, listen to all 6. You will learn a lot about a topic you may not be familiar with. Justice is a topic we're all familiar with. We all want to find it. We all want it to be achieved when an injustice has occurred. This is really about the systemic problems and obtaining even basic elemental justice among Native people on Native lands in this country. Cara, Bo, it's interesting that you did this. We've had kind of a story about how you approached it journalistically. Because the Outtake Especial tends to have a pop culture aspect to it, these topics are now in our pop culture mentality being more frequently explored. Yellowstone explores them. Longmire, a program I'm very familiar with, explores them in different ways. There are movies about this. Is America and our pop culture sensibilities orienting itself different to this history? Bo?
I think there's a growing awareness among non-Native people for this specific crisis that's happening, the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis. These are obviously not new concepts for Native communities all throughout. I think there is a high bar of knowledge that needs to be attained for, people in media to even feel comfortable talking about these issues. So I think, those are way bigger problems than we can get into right now. But it does feel like there is more attention being paid for. There's going to be a new movie by Martin Scorsese coming out next year to talk about the backstory of some of these federal law enforcement agencies. That one's called Killers of a Flower Moon, hopefully coming out next year.
Killers of a Flower Moon.
Based on a book.
Of the same title.
Based on a book. But, you mentioned Yellowstone as well. These issues of the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis are in Yellowstone. And so when we go around and we ask Native folks about those, there's a varying degrees of welcoming to to this kind of pop culture element here.
Yeah, I'm sure there's part of it is, where have you been?
Hello? 100%. 100%. And they just really, want media and pop culture to stay away from all those horrible tropes
and stereotypes.
I think that's the tricky thing as well, is that it's wonderful that, as you said, pop culture is beginning to highlight some of these issues. But then, these are not the most sugary stories. These are rough. And there are also shows like Reservation Dogs. And I know there's a comedy on Peacock that's written by a Native American woman is the primary writer of that series. I believe she stars in it as well. I can't remember what it's called right now, but I think what's really great is hopefully we will see, just as much as there are these depictions of the harshest realities, there are depictions that celebrate the amazing culture that we experience just going to a Native American powwow, of the music and the regalia, the dress, the food. There are so many. This is our history. This is American culture, and so few of us know it.
And if you spend any time reading the collected wisdom of Native peoples in this country, it's beautiful.
Yes.
They have a very strong orientation to the longevity of life, the flow of life, the interrelationship of generations, the interrelationship of man to animal, to plant, to the world around them. It's integrated, it's humble. There's a tremendous inspirational beauty in it, I've found.
Certainly. My day job is covering climate, and in that I cover the Interior Department. And when Deb Haaland, the current Interior Secretary, who is a Native woman herself, she belongs to the Laguna Pueblo tribe in New Mexico, I wrote a story about when she was appointed, what that means for Native people, but also culturally that alignment of how the harmony of a Native American running the Interior Department, which oversees our lands, was very poetic to many, many people.
Bo?
And I was just going to say, incredibly welcoming. When we showed up at this powwow in North Dakota, where a bunch of dancers came together, and what a powwow is, just really quickly, it's essentially a competitive dance competition with all of these historical dances, and they compete there. I've never been to a powwow before, and so we're going around asking people. Everyone at this powwow was just so happy we were there asking questions. They loved when members of the North Dakota public were showing up there. The same thing we experienced in Northern Cheyenne. Everyone was just really happy that we were asking questions to them, trying to put a spotlight on this community. And one quick point is that, these communities look like a lot of other communities throughout the country. The towns that we were in, Lame Deer, Montana, Northern Cheyenne, looks like a small town from Marshall, Minnesota, as well, that I grew up in. And so it is not this far distant off community that no one has any type of sense of how they can picture it. This looks like America. This is America.
A lot of folks said to us when they heard we were doing this, or who have now heard the podcast, said to us, how did you break into these communities? How did you get these people to trust you? These people are screaming at the top of their lungs
to be
for
seen.
Someone to listen to them and look at them. Exactly.
To be seen and heard.
We did not have to crack some code to get a hold of these folks.
They said to show up and ask.
Yes.
Exactly.
That's where a lot of really great journalism begins, ladies and gentlemen. You first show up, then you ask. And lots of things can happen from there. And Bo Erickson and Cara Korte, my colleagues at CBS News, have set that in motion. I highly recommend Missing Justice. Find the podcast. You will not regret it. I'm Major Garrett. So concludes our Takeout Outtake Especial. Cara, Bo, thanks so much. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.